The goal today is simply to get through these two segments. It's about 2 slides and one part of a third slide. This is just building on what we were talking about yesterday. Remember we finished determining the distinctions between sex, gender, and sexuality. So now that we've wrapped up with sexuality, it's a good segue right into the biology of sexuality. And you might be asking right off the bat why in a morality class we'd be addressing the biology of it. But it's part of it, all right? It's part of the discussion. It's impossible for us to separate it. The first quote makes that plain. John Paul II was quoted as saying, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition." And that's true. If left on its own, many religions result in some form of fundamentalism, do they not? And they actually are opposed to science. In this way, we could read science and reason as the same thing. But John Paul II then finishes by saying, and let's not forget that the opposite is true. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. In other words, if a person is what we call scientism, right, where everything has to be proved empirically and science is the only level of truth, that is a form of idolatry. And also false positives in the sense that although science is the highest burden of proof, it does not mean that that is the last truth to be said on a subject. That could be whether we're talking about something very serious about, what might cause a particular disease, or if, like my experience has been over the last 30 years, is that drinking coffee has gotten bad and good and bad and good and good and bad and worse and better. Every few years it changes depending on what research is out there. As a matter of fact, I was delighted the other day. I read a scientific journal that said a higher BMI actually has you have a longer life, longevity expectation if you have a lower BMI. Now that's not the obese category, that's like the category between 24 and 30. If you're in that category, you statistically will have the longest life. It used to be lower than that. That's good news. It is for me. So between coffee and the BMI change, I'm just waiting for bacon to be termed healthy, and then life is good, Right, Owen?
Yeah.
That'd be a good day. So anyway, let's keep both of these things in perspective. Okay, so let's start out by saying about whether there is or is not a gay gene. And the answer is at least settled. Unless something does change, there is no gay gene. The genome has been mapped. There's good evidence other than that, than why there is no gay gene. Twin studies, right? If one twin, and then we'll see a little statistics on that. If one twin, identical twin was gay, then genetically speaking, his twin would have to be gay, and that's not the case. Also, evolutionary biologists would bring out that if there were a gay gene, the likelihood of it surviving hundreds and hundreds of generations would be almost nil, So there's something else there. So anyway, this doesn't mean that there isn't a genetic link, okay? The fact that there's not a gay gene doesn't mean that there isn't some genetic link or genetic connection. We still say that there is there. I'll explain what this is in a minute, right? So here they're saying, could epigenetics explain homosexuality? And I'll tell you what that is in a minute. Well, let's just look at this one paragraph, right? So if homosexuality does run in families, which is clear, how come only 20% of identical twins are both gay? Okay? So if it runs in families, there's something being inherited, but it's not purely genetic in that sense. So what else is there? They're thinking maybe epigenetics can explain that, all right? Made them suspicious that something besides genes produces a heritability that isn't genetic. Now, I'll show you other examples of this, but this is really interesting as a field. So they're finding that women who were carrying children, either like during the Depression, or if they'd gotten pregnant in a concentration camp, or if they're just in dire poverty, that those children have a higher incidence of both obesity and type 2 diabetes. What did they inherit? Well, what they inherited was, that feast mode. In other words, so a person could be in constant starvation mode because somehow they inherit that inclination. This also explains why some people get cancer from smoking, other ones don't, perhaps. So I had a friend, he's now in his mid to late 60s, so it's been a while since he was in college. When he was in college, for 4 years, all summer, you know what his job was at Armstrong Industries in Lancaster? His job was to take bales of asbestos fibers, cut them open, and shake them into a hopper. This guy shook asbestos fibers for 4 summers, and then he smoked for 38 years, clear lungs. Then why is it then simply that a friend of mine who never smoked, but her dad did smoke, so she did have access to secondhand smoke, she died at 31 of lung cancer, you know? If there's not a strong genetic link, there's something in the environment that's affecting this, all right? So what is that? Now, there's other things to explain that too, but here's something. They found, this is just one little study, that they found people who are experiencing PTSD as adults have different reactions. So if a person went through some trauma in childhood or abuse, beyond the physical and psychological aspects of it, it could have literally, without, and you'll see, without changing the DNA sequence, it affected the genetics. I won't go through, but they find different expressions and patterns in these people, right? System development, immune system regulation, right? Depending on whether or not a person, 2 people that have PTSD. Now, why is this important? Because if you're treating this as an adult, now they're going to need to know what was your childhood like, not just for psychological reasons, but for medical reasons. So it's interesting stuff. So what epigenetics is, it's an alteration in the chemical modification of DNA without changing the sequence, in the DNA sequence. It's alterations in the chemical modification of DNA without changing the sequence. So you can have 2 twins with identical DNA, but somehow one of the chemical modifications was altered into one. He's homosexual, the other one's heterosexual. So this could be, you know, the flooding of hormones in utero. It could be childhood experiences. It could be a host of various things that are brought to bear. They often use the term, it's not very scientific, but they use the term almost like there's gates that could open and close because of particular instances. And we have no idea really what. Is it environmental? Is it something hormonal? I mean, they really don't know. When I say chemical, I'm not talking about chemical from the outside. I'm talking about how the cell itself reacts. Okay, that's all a cell can do is something chemically. Now, this epigenetic link would then explain the phenomenon of being born that way. All right? This epigenetic link would explain the phenomenon of being born that way. So, I have no recollection of ever being attracted to anything else than women. I mean, I couldn't pinpoint when did I start being attracted to women. It's always been there. So that's my reality, all right? I'm born this way. My friends that are homosexual share the same experience. They can't pinpoint any moment when they were attracted to anybody but the same sex. So when they say they're born that way, whether it happened in utero or whether it happened in very early childhood, it affected, not the sequence, but the ultimate chemical modifications, there's no reason not to accept that. Now, that's not a construct. That's a reality, which is why I differentiated that from what we spoke about yesterday concerning gender fluidity. That is not a reality. That's just an appearance. Homosexuality is a reality. If I were an advocate for that, I would distance myself from gender fluidity. I don't think, there's no science over there, okay? So if somebody says, I'm born that way, we say yes, we agree, okay? So we're on the same page probably with that. Now, here's the problem, though. If it's true that a person is born that way, and again, we have no reason to think otherwise, it does not follow that one must then act on that inclination or predisposition, whatever you want to call it. It does not follow that one must then act on that inclination. And we know that too, and I'll explain why we know that. So let's just reiterate, okay, what I mean here. And then I have a syllogism and I'll explain this, so if you didn't get it, hopefully you'll get it when I'm done. In other words, if we say you're born that way, therefore you should be allowed to act on it, concerning sexuality, Sexuality cannot have its own standard in terms of, let me see how I want to say it to you so it makes good sense, of what is biologically not a choice. Sexuality cannot have its own standard in terms of what biologically is not a choice. You know, even things that don't have moral elements. If I had an inclination and found out that I had some epigenetic, predisposition to cancer, I would not accept that, right? I would fight that, right? Now that's not a moral choice. But in terms of this, just because somebody is born that way, doesn't mean we have to accept what is not biologically a choice. So we see things like this. You don't need to write this down just so you understand it. If we say homosexual tendencies can be explained by epigenetic influences, that's probably true. Epigenetic influences cannot be resisted. That's what the world is saying pretty much right now. If you're born that way, you need to go with it. Therefore, homosexual tendencies cannot be resisted. All right. So, what I would say is, if we were to say, pull out the word tendencies and put in practices, homosexual practices can be explained by epigenetic influences. Probably true. Epigenetic influences cannot be resisted. No, I disagree with that premise. All right. I think that's where we go wrong. That because we're born that way, that we have no influence otherwise. And I know that people think it's cynical, but I said it when I was talking to you about the Imago Dei. I think the Catholic Church has a high regard for the human person. So the top two things in the Imago Dei, I said, was that we are made in His image, in that we are rational and we are free. And then I tried to contrast it with what the world says. Rather than being rational, they said you're a product, go to your instincts. There's no reason to not go towards it. Rather than being free, you're biologically determined. The church steps in and says, no, you're not an animal. You can rise above this, okay? And what I mean then by the sexuality can have its own standard is, first of all, epigenetics as a field isn't out to try to settle the homosexual question. It's almost, that's done as a side, right? They're after other things. This too, they're after. Pedophilia. They find strong epigenetic links between people who have pedophilia. And by the way, most pedophiles will call that an orientation. They did not choose it. We know if we learn nothing from the 70s in psychology, you think of the sex scandals within the church, you can't cure a person who has an affinity for young children. You cannot. Okay? At one time they thought you could. Now we realize they can't. They're going to have to find a way to integrate it. Which, if you go to most search engines, or any search engine, and type in virtuous pedophile, it's not a bad site. Don't think there's anything bad about it. You'll find a website of people who claim that this is their orientation, but they refuse to act on it. They call themselves virtuous pedophiles. So much so that they actually argue against calling the act pedophilia. Like if somebody committed sex with a young person, he's a pedophile. They want the language to be clear. Call that person a child abuser, because they're saying we are pedophiles. We don't do that. All right. That would almost be like taking if homosexuals, were committing something wrong, rather than calling the act, that's done by homosexuals. They say, can you be clear and make a difference between the orientation and the act? Okay. So what they're finding is there's epigenetic markers for this. Now I know there's a difference between the dynamics of two men and two women and a person and a young child. But under no circumstances would we say if they're born that way, then therefore, they should act on it. We wouldn't say that, okay? Other ones, I'm not going to be exhaustive. Violence is really the biggest connections. A lot of research has been done with people that commit violent crimes, people that are high risk takers. The epigenetic connection is pretty strong. We would not allow that. I mean, if somebody were, abusing their wife, or if somebody were committing violent crimes, we would take that into consideration, maybe what they're sentencing, but under no circumstances would it be excused because they were born that way. They're also finding epigenetic markers for people that commit acts of adultery or, infidelity within their marriage. So just think, if you were married to somebody and it turns out that you have one of these, these markers or these variations where it's more than likely that you will commit adultery, under no circumstances is your spouse going to buy that, I mean, if you know it, then you have to integrate it. All right? So my point is that if we laid out everything that maybe we are born this way with, why is it that we are critical of it and say, no, you have to find a way to manage that, but when it comes to sexuality, they should be allowed? It's two standards. That's all I'm trying to say. I think that's reasonable to mention. Okay? So in the end, a Catholic view of the human person always raises one's rationality above one's instinct. We always raise... Excuse me. Hello. Okay. So, raising one's rationality above one's instincts, thus retaining free will, right? In other words, if you're not responsible for what you've done, like if you have a predisposition for cancer, and you get cancer, nobody's going to say, well, what'd you do that for? I mean, that's not a moral element, I know that, right? But the only way we can ever be held accountable morally is if we have free will. The minute you take that away, I mean, if it were determined somehow, this won't happen, that there was absolutely zero control over it, well, you can't hold a person, against that. And we know that in the courts of the common law, because if people are deemed, insane or incapable of trial, for whatever reasons, they can't be held accountable at the same level as somebody that has their wits about them, right? So anyway, any questions on this? It's just a brief one-slide presentation, but it should help.
The first one, whatever you say, eugenics, right on.
Where you at?
I'm trying to...
This one?
Yeah, the first. No, the first one.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, alterations in the chemical modification of DNA without changing the sequence. So the genome stays. The genetic DNA sequence never is altered. I'm sorry, no, it is altered. It never changes, but it does alter through chemical modifications. And if you read about it, times you read, like, they'll say, like, epigenetic markers, or they'll talk about, like, these, it's a pedestrian way to say it, but, like, the gate will open, and somehow that particular gene got affected, but the gene doesn't change. It's the only way they're trying to explain how you can pass this stuff on. In other words, how can homosexuality run in a family when we know that there's not a gay gene? Well, they're trying to say this must be it. It's not just, well, they picked up behavior from their parents. That really wouldn't make sense, Okay. Now, the historical perspective, I was telling other classes, this tends to be the one thing when students come back to see me 3 and 4 years later, it's the only thing they remember. Did you tell them about that stuff that went on in ancient Greece yet? So let me say up front that these are generalizations, and they have to be. We're talking about an ancient civilization that probably, had behaviors over the course of 300 years, and we're over 2,000 years removed. Doesn't mean we don't know anything about it. That just means that we're being general. But this is really based on historical records. We have access to the laws of that culture to some extent. And I have checked with historians and asked them, even though this is very simple in general, is it correct? They said, yeah, overall, that's pretty good. So in ancient Greece, and the reason why I'm even addressing this is because I'm not a magazine article person. Sometimes you get good magazines. Typically, magazine articles are just one step above a slogan, right? They have a point of view. They have to have some kind of like catchy title that usually has nothing to do with what's in the material, the content. And they can't develop a thought very deeply because they have to speak to a very general population on the 4th grade level, right? So I urge you to be a book person if you really have a choice. If you want to read something shorter, read journals, okay? That being said, I've been in enough discussions where people will bring up as a comeback, well, but homosexuality has always existed. Look at the ancient cultures. They were okay with it. Their understanding of what we would call today the homosexual orientation, there's no parallel. So that's all I'm trying to show you here. There's no parallel. Pure love, according to the Greeks, separated procreation from the sexual act. The love between a man and woman was utilitarian, okay? And that was an issue for them. The love between a man and a woman was utilitarian. In other words, pure love would have no other goal except to express affection. to have a kid, that's another reason. And that kind of takes away from the reason to show affection. So for them, that alone was the reason. Now this is Western culture that we're talking about here per se. And women did not have the status they obviously do today. So a woman was maybe not at the level of property, but she certainly was not at the same level as a man. So marriage was imposed on the woman as a role. Her job was to take care of household tasks and bear children. So what I'm going to do is I'll have a few lines here. I'll give you some information about it, and then I'll tie it all together so you understand it. Pederasty is the label for that love between a man and his boy, and in Greek, theis. And the boy was post-pubescent, okay? So this is not what we would call today pedophilia. This child is already past the age of puberty, but they are not yet an adult. So we're just going to put it in the 12 to 17 year range, although there's nothing concrete about that, okay? The love between a man and his boy was the moral norm of quote unquote homosexual love, okay? It was the moral norm of quote unquote homosexual love. In other words, they would not have ever called it homosexuality, but we would think of it today as homosexuality. So I'm trying to be clear that I'm using a term really in the wrong way, but it helps us understand it. So it was the moral norm of quote unquote homosexual love. It's going to seem odd, but this boy was brought in what we would call a pedagogical element. In other words, they were to be instructed. So think of kind of like a combination of, like, say, a nanny and a tutor, all right? Like, the child will be taken care of, and the child will be instructed, the child is going to make connections, and the child is going to be brought up in the way of culture and also in education, okay? But it must be between free persons. This was not a slave-master relationship. It must be between free persons. After this, I'll go back and explain it. When the boy became an adult, he'd be sharply criticized for any same-sex relations. When the boy became an adult, he would be sharply criticized for any same-sex relations. All right. Anything on that before I try to explain it to you? Yes.
When he were to get older, if he did, would he like have a boy?
Oh, I'll explain that in a sec. Yeah. I mean, any questions here? That's okay, Anthony. Okay, here's how this worked. Okay, there was nothing done like hidden. All right. So, if a prominent person or even a well-situated male came to your family and said, I would like to have your boys at pass, that would be an honor. So you would gladly, it would be like today that if if a business person said, hey, I'd like to take your kid under my wing, yeah, go ahead. Only then it had a sexual component, okay? Now the reason why they would have sex with the boys is, to them it was pure. There's no procreation here. So it only could be affinity and for the child's upbringing. I know that sounds very peculiar to us, but that's their world. And it was also okay because the child was a boy, because the male was a child, they can act effeminate, and there was no shame. They can act like, they would refer to it as the passive role. The man, at no time considered, there was no sense of orientation like we have today. There's really no parallels. The man did not think of himself as a homosexual. He was married. His wife was fully aware of this. It was nothing like, hey, I'll be back later. I mean, they all knew what was going on. There were actually laws that surrounded and protected this. So this was his way of extending his affinity, his training, and his love for this child. And then the child would accept that. And it was absolutely sexual. When the child hits of age, 18 or so, at that point it had to stop. Because even though it may sound odd to us, to them, two adult males in homosexuality was disgusting. Why? Because they never, the ancient world never lost that dichotomy of masculine and feminine. And I'm not going to be overgeneralizing, but even like my friends that are homosexual, you still see, you know, masculine, feminine roles with two women or two men. They're still there somewhere. That dichotomy has not totally been wiped away. So there was no problem with a boy acting effeminate or passive. That seemed appropriate for their age. But now that you're a man, no more of that. You have to be a man. You can't be passive or feminine. So if we were transported back to their time, we would find that disgusting, that a man's having sexual intercourse with a boy, especially for affinity and pedagogical reasons. But let's just be certain that if they were transported to our time and saw two men engaged in sex, to them that would be disgusting. Why is that man acting like an effeminate person? And under no times would they consider this homosexual orientation. So I guess my point is to show that when we talk about homosexuality in the ancient world, particularly the Greek world, there's no parallels. All right, it doesn't have the same parallel. Okay, you kind of get that? Okay. Just the last thing about this, and I guess I should have brought it up earlier. This is all known as ephebic love. Ephebic love was not considered to be homosexual orientation. Okay. Ephebic love was not considered to be homosexual orientation. Now, was this 100% the case in every part of Greece over the course of 300 or 400 years? I can't say. You know, I'm just telling you this was a general understanding. In Rome, we have a different story. And again, the Roman Empire is huge, and it encompasses a lot of different cultures. Okay? So I am certain that you would find some homosexual activity throughout the Roman Empire. But we also have access to the Roman laws and such. So we get a sense of, you know, you could always look at a culture's laws, legal system, and get a feel for their morality. So homosexuality was sort of a private matter. You know what it meant to be a Roman citizen. A Roman citizen carried with it rights and privileges. Because remember St. Paul? St. Paul was not crucified. But once they found out he was a Roman citizen, they beheaded him. Because that was the only death that was worthy of a Roman citizen. Otherwise, we crucify it, which was more hideous, demeaning. So if you were not a Roman citizen, like if you were a master, and a master may take their boy, their girl, their woman, their man, and have sex with, do what he wants, their property. I mean, there was no question. But that was like private. There was like really nothing like, they didn't really have the same idea as the Greeks. And we know that because we see at points pederasty was illegal in Rome. Okay, in the Roman Empire we're talking. And we also find that even prostitutes, adult males or women prostitutes, that were Roman citizens, they were deprived of certain civil liberties if they chose that sexual deviancy. They were deprived of certain civil liberties. Oh, by the way, I should mention here, because I haven't said anything about women or lesbian relationships. That's because it's almost unheard of in the ancient world. A woman was to bear children. The affinity between the pure love, the ephebic love, that was male things, all right? And somebody said, like, who wrote about this? Cicero had written that probably this Greek vice, is what they called it, originated in the gymnasiums. Because if you know anything about Greek gymnasiums, they were bathhouses, and even when wrestling, exercises, Olympics were all done entirely nude, right? So they had a different understanding of the male form and beauty, for whatever reason. I'm not an expert on the field. This guy was a medical doctor in the 2nd century A.D. So Cyrannus, he considered homosexuality the disease of a corrupt mind. So Cyrannus, as a medical doctor, thought there was a psychological reason why people were attracted to the same sex, which inevitably became the mainstay until, I think the 1970s or 80s when it was just changed. Not a lot of, I think it was more political, but that's another issue. By 438 A.D., all passive homosexuality was banned. And that's male. Okay, because women are by nature passive, according to their views. Yes?
What do you mean passive?
Passive means that one person acted like the woman, because that's the passive position, right? And you can notice the date there, we're about 100 years in now that empire has been Christianized. Not entirely, right? If you know the history, it's gone back and forth with emperors. But since 425, not quite 100 years, you have, 325, I'm sorry, you have the Council of Constantine. Okay. 2 little points and we're done. We're not going to do this slide. I just want to wrap up the historical record. It did not fit on the previous slide. With ancient Jews, and this is for us that are Christian, this is our heritage. The opposition to all forms of same-sex attraction goes back 8,000 BC. I mean, there's never been a deviance. The Jews have always been opposed to this. You know, they were the neighbors to the Greeks and the Romans. They always opposed it. So they adopted the most rigorous opposition to all forms of same-sex attraction. We will then say that Jews, and then obviously Christians, stood apart from all other cultures in terms of what today we call homosexuality. Okay? They stood apart from all other cultures in terms of what today we call homosexuality. So now, I guess that's it for the notes right now, but give me like a minute as a lead into tomorrow, because tomorrow I want to talk about the biblical background of this. Here's the issue. We have Christian denominations that accept homosexuality as natural, and also it's welcome in their church. Well, if they have the same Bible that we do, why is it then that some denominations accept it and some don't? I'm going to show you the biblical background of it, but I've stopped doing what I used to do 6 years ago. I would try to make an argument from Scripture, and I would try to show them the reasoning behind it, and I realized it was above the level of high school, because we have to get into Greek terms, use of Greek terms, the frequency of the use of Greek terms, and nobody was following the argument. I will show you where it's at in Scripture, and I will show you the Greek terms. I'm just not going to base it. And I can share with you this. Well, actually, let me